In 1804, the Ottoman Empire looked like this. Europe was in the midst of the French Revolutionary Wars, which had seen an invasion of Egypt in 1798, alongside the British. The Ottomans pushed the French out. During the chaos, a man named Muhammad Ali, an officer from the Albanian provinces, seized control of Egypt in 1805, becoming its viceroy. The early 19th century also saw a revolt in Serbia, which began in 1804 in response to their treatment by the Ottomans. The Serbians asked Russia for help, which the Russians gave during the Russo-Ottoman War that began in 1806. The man in charge of the Ottoman Empire at this point was Sultan Selim III, who was primarily a reformer and modernizer. One of these reforms was the modernization of the army. This was resisted by the Janissaries, an order of what was originally elite slave soldiers, but over time had become a corrupt, bloated group of politically active freemen. Selim created a new corps of infantrymen called the New Order, which doesn't sound menacing at all. The Janissaries revolted, deposed Selim in 1807, and replaced him with the new Sultan Mustafa IV. Mustafa immediately faced a counter-rebellion and so ordered that Selim be killed, as well as any other potential heirs, to secure his position. He didn't quite get them all, though, and so the rebel army deposed him in favor of his brother, who became Sultan Mahmud II in 1808. In 1812, the Ottomans signed a peace treaty with the Russians, yielding this territory. The Serbian Revolution was still ongoing at this point, and after a brief Ottoman reconquest, Serbia was granted the status of a semi-independent principality in 1817. This would not be the last Ottoman defeat in the Balkans, though, as demonstrated by the Greek War of Independence, which began in 1821. The Ottomans failed to suppress the revolution, and so Mahmud turned to Muhammad Ali of Egypt to help, which he did. Ali was much more successful than Mahmud had been, and within 3 years, the revolt was essentially broken. The Greek War of Independence had caught the eye of the major powers, though, in Russia, Britain, and France had been trying to pressure the Ottomans into letting Greece go, which they refused. Domestically, Mahmud was attempting to modernize the Ottoman state, and like his predecessor, he ran into opposition from the Janissaries. The Janissaries revolted, but unlike the last time, the Sultan's forces won. After crushing them in 1826, Mahmud had the Janissaries dissolved. Mahmud oversaw further reforms, including granting greater rights to Christian and Jewish minorities, strengthening the state by clamping down on tribal allegiances, and also relaxing clothing laws, which broke down social barriers. In 1827, a naval standoff off the coast of Greece between the great powers and the Ottomans turned hot, and the Ottoman navy was crushed. French forces then landed in Greece, and the Egyptians soon after left. In 1830, the great powers recognized Greece as an independent republic and later a kingdom. France also took Algeria. The weakness shown by the Central Ottoman state was capitalized upon by Muhammad Ali. In 1831, Egypt, which Muhammad Ali had grown to this, invaded and swept across the Levant and into Anatolia. By 1832, the Egyptian territory looked like this, and it looked like the Egyptians were just about to depose the Sultan. But in a strange twist of events, the Russians intervened and blocked the route to Constantinople. Britain and France put pressure on Ali, and so in 1833, a peace treaty was concluded which gave Egypt control of this territory, but it was still technically a vassal of the Ottomans. Tensions between Muhammad Ali and the Ottoman Sultan remained throughout the 1830s, and culminated in a second war beginning in 1839. Shortly after its outbreak, Mahmud II died and was succeeded by his son Abdul Hamid. The war went pretty poorly for the Ottomans at first, even though they started it. It was only through the intervention of Russia, Prussia, Britain, and the Austrian Empire that Muhammad Ali agreed to peace in 1841. This peace gave this territory back to the Ottomans and saw Ali's family recognized as the legitimate rulers of Egypt. The reason the European powers were desperate to intervene was that they wanted a weak Ottoman empire that they could exploit. If the modernizing and assertive Egypt were to have won the war, then the European powers could have been shut out and lost their influence in the region, the most important aspect of international diplomacy for the Ottomans. in the second half of the 19th century was its relationship with Russia. Russia considered itself the protector of all Christians within the Ottoman Empire, and France under Napoleon III wished to take that mantle for itself. The Russians demanded that their position be respected. These demands weren't met, and war ensued. The Russians invaded the Balkan principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, thus beginning the Crimean War. France and Britain, worried about Russia becoming too powerful, chose to intervene on the side of the Ottomans, alongside the Sardinians. Long story short, the Russians did well initially. The Allies invaded Crimea, hence the name. A bunch of people died, and Russian internal problems led them to sue for peace in 1856. The peace didn't really change much, except it prevented the militarization of the Black Sea, which weakened Russia. It also demanded that the Ottomans give Christians equal rights to Muslims, which, to be fair to them, they were doing anyway. The Ottoman decline had been halted, but only temporarily and only because it suited some of the great powers. The next couple of decades were fairly quiet for the Ottomans, barring a failed rebellion in Crete and the unification of Wallachia and Moldavia in 1862 into what would later be called Romania. This period also importantly saw the Ottoman Empire use more foreign credit. Furthermore, the Egyptians began to drift further away from the Ottoman orbit when the Suez Canal was opened in 1869, giving France and Britain a financial stake there. The 1870s was a decade of immense difficulty for the Ottomans. In 1871, a crop failure led to a revolt in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which in turn led to these provinces not paying their taxes, which put strain on Ottoman finances. This, combined with the inefficiencies of the Ottoman bureaucracy, the lavish lifestyle of its Sultan Abdul Aziz, and the immense cost of the armed forces, led the Ottomans to default in 1876. To make matters worse, Herzegovina's governor went into full revolt in 1875, and Bulgaria followed suit the following year. Things got even worse when Sultan Abdul Aziz was overthrown in a coup and replaced by his nephew Murad V. Murad had a long and successful reign, by which I mean he was in charge for 93 days, before he himself was overthrown in favor of his brother Abdul Hamid II. Abdul Hamid attempted to bring in some reforms, the most notable being the Ottoman Constitution of 1876. This allowed for elections and took some power from the Sultan, but ultimately it would be repealed only 2 years later. Abdul Hamid's early reign got off to a rocky start when both Serbia and Montenegro declared war. The Ottomans were able to crush the uprising in Bulgaria, and they did so brutally, which brought international condemnation, especially from Russia. The great powers sought to find a solution to the Balkan crisis, but the Ottomans rejected the demands, and so war ensued. Romania, still an Ottoman vassal, allowed Russia to cross through its territory and soon after declared its independence. The Russian troops reached Bulgaria alongside defenses from Bulgarians, Serbs, and Montenegrins. The Ottomans didn't fare too well. After pressure from the other great powers, the Russians sued for peace, and the Ottomans were forced to sign the Treaty of San Stefano in 1877, which turned the Balkans from this to this. The Bulgarian state was supposed to be a Russian puppet, which would give Russia access to Mediterranean ports which Britain did not like, because Britain liked Russia trapped in the Black Sea. As a response, the Congress of Berlin was called the next year, and the territories were rearranged by the great powers. In the end, this was agreed on. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro became fully independent. Bosnia and Herzegovina were occupied by Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria was to be a semi-independent principality under the rule of Prince Alexander I. Another treaty saw Britain gain Cyprus, France gain Tunisia, and Greece gain this territory. To make things worse for the Ottomans, the great powers created the Ottoman Public Debt Administration to make sure that the empire never defaulted on its debts again. The OPDA took over a significant chunk of the Ottoman economy and created monopolies and products, like tobacco and cotton, in order to guarantee that foreign investors would get their money. Foreign influence increased when the British occupied Egypt in 1882, mostly to secure the Suez Canal from revolt in Egypt, but also because they could. The Ottoman Empire was not without power, though. It was importantly one of the few independent Muslim states in the world, and the Sultan was the Caliph, the latest in the line of succession to the Prophet Muhammad, and the spiritual head of Islam. The Ottomans wanted to keep this status, and so Abdul Hamid sought to modernize the state to protect it. This included wide-ranging educational reform, including universal education, but also saw the creation of an intrusive state surveillance apparatus. State surveillance was needed to root out opposition to the Sultan, which had been growing through many secret societies that operated both inside and outside the empire, the most notable of these being the Committee of Union and Progress and the Young Turks. The Young Turk Revolution broke out in 1908 in Macedonia, with the intent of preventing the carving up of the Empire's Balkan provinces by the great powers, and reissuing the Constitution of 1876. Capitalizing on the internal chaos, Bulgaria declared independence, Greece annexed Crete, and Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, but it was basically theirs already. The revolution was successful sort of, and the Sultan conceded to the Young Turks' demands before too much damage was done. Things wouldn't settle down, though, since a counter-coup was launched the next year by more religiously conservative officers in the army. This coup failed. Abdul Hamid II was blamed and later deposed in favor of his brother Mehmed V, the new Sultan. Along with important reformers like Ismail Enver, sought to unify and strengthen the empire. These reforms went quite well at first, but again trouble came a knocking, this time in the shape of a boot called Italy, who invaded the Ottoman province of Tripolitania, now known as Libya. In 1911, the Italians won handily, taking the North African territories and these islands. Seeing how weak the Ottomans were, many Balkan nations capitalized and invaded, beginning the First Balkan War. The Ottomans lost, Albania became independent, and the Balkans went from this to this. Bulgaria was unhappy with these gains, and so about 4 seconds after this, the Second Balkan War began. The Ottomans sided with Serbia, Greece, and Romania. Bulgaria lost, and the Balkans were carved up again. The next year, 1914, was a big year for the Ottomans since World War I began. Long story short, the war was lost, and after the Ottoman surrender, the British and French under the Sykes-Picot Agreement carved up the empire. The Turks were not happy about having their country occupied, and so fought back against the Allied powers, beginning the Turkish War of Independence. They were led by a man called Mustafa Kemal. In the 1920 election, his party was victorious. The British, unhappy with this, dissolved the parliament, and so Kemal founded a new seat of power, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara. War broke out soon afterwards, and within 3 years against all odds the Turks were victorious, driving out the occupying powers and asserting their independence in these borders. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, was deposed, and the position of Sultan abolished in 1922, thus formally ending the 600-year-old Ottoman Empire. The next year, on October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was declared with Kemal as its first president. In 1934, he would be granted the title Ataturk, the father of the Turks. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching.